Well, graduates, it's the day. I'm proud of you. I love each one of you. Okay, I'm here to introduce the speaker. It is my honor this evening to introduce our commencement speaker. He is one of our own, a member of the Urshan community. The official part of the bio would read, his love for education can be clearly seen through the numerous degrees he holds. He has his BA in English Literature and Religious Studies and an MA in Humanities from Western Kentucky University. He also holds an MTS and an MA and a PhD in Religion at Vanderbilt University. 5 degrees. For the Paris, some may call you an overachiever. He is the author of several books, which include 2 handbooks for the UPCI Ministerial Training Program. For the Apostolic Study Bible, he edited Genesis through Esther, contributed introductory articles and notes, and worked on the concordance. But now, let me add the unofficial bio. What makes Dr. Parris unique for me is his wonderful ability to fit into any group on campus. It's not uncommon to see him sitting at a table, talking with a colleague or a UGST student about narrative criticism or discussing Hebrew. At the same time, you could come back a couple of hours later and he's on his cell phone walking the campus looking for Pokemon. Or playing volleyball with undergraduates. He showed me a new side of academics this last fall when he guest lectured for my class. As we began class, he came running in with sunglasses on and wearing a superhero costume. He then proceeded to teach an outstanding lecture on biblical leadership and apostolic identity. It takes a unique individual to pull that off. It's true. For me, he models so much of what I love about Urshan. As a community, we each are unique in our callings. We don't often fit in a typical mold, but we embrace each other and those gifts and encourage one another to see where we fit into the kingdom. Please give a warm Urshan welcome to Dr. Chris Parris, our Urshan Graduate School Academic Dean.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm both thankful and surprised to be here to share this joyous occasion with our graduates, their friends and family, and our faculty, staff, and board. I did not expect to be in this role at Urshan, and I certainly did not expect to be speaking at this graduation. In fact, on the very day that Dr. Bernard asked me to become UGST Dean, my wife, Lydia, and I had just met with our pastor, and he asked us about our future at Urshan. She told him that we would probably play a small part on the fringes, but nothing further would come of it. And yet, God had other plans. So here I am, like many of you, trying to walk worthy of my calling, as the Apostle Paul wrote in Ephesians 4:1, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, that you walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you are called. Many would say that answering the call is part of creating a legacy, and I believe that they are right. However, I also appreciate the words of astronaut and U.S. Senator John Glenn, who said, I'm not interested in my legacy. I made up a word, livacy. I'm more interested in living. I think Glenn makes an excellent point. We should enjoy our lives in the path that God has set before us. Of course, it was through his livacy that John Glenn achieved his legacy. And I hope that each of you graduates has enjoyed the process. And know this, that your livacy will create a lasting legacy. Graduates, I commend you for answering the call to learn. And I want to talk to you about 3 things this evening. 1, the lessons you committed to learn. 2, the things you unintentionally learned. And 3, I want to share one final lesson and challenge concerning livacy and legacy. All of you committed to learn a number of things at Urshan, and you have done very well. But while we congratulate you on your expertise in a variety of areas, I can't help feel bad for all of the family and friends who journeyed here, because many of them haven't experienced some of the wonderful learning opportunities you've had at Urshan. So I want to take a few minutes and teach them some of the things you committed to learn. So we'll start off with Hebrew. Welcome to Hebrew School. I'll be your rabbi. Shalom, everyone. Wow, you're doing great so far. Now, I don't have time to teach you a great deal of Hebrew, but we'll cover one of my favorite Hebrew phrases, burrito. The word burrito means his covenant in Hebrew. And yes, it does sound like we're speaking Spanish instead of Hebrew. Well, happy Cinco de Mayo, everyone. Now, I once had a student who so loved the Hebrew phrase burrito that she often brought breakfast burritos to class, and at the end of the course, she wished me burrito blessings, which I wish to you now. In my opinion, burritos are definitely a covenant food. And if we mix the Hebrew and the English together, we can create a very interesting reading of Psalm 111, verse 5. He hath given meat unto them that fear him. He will be ever mindful of his burrito. Now, it's fun to play with Hebrew words, but we should never forget the covenant that God has made with us. And if it takes going to Chimmy's to remind us of that covenant, we've got to do what we've got to do. Of course, one of my fellow faculty members would be highly disappointed in me if I taught you Hebrew and neglected Greek. So we'll have a quick Greek lesson. I think you may already know how to speak some of it. Look at your neighbor and say, Lego my ego. Lego my ego is Greek for I say to myself. Now, this exact phrase, Lego my ego, does not appear in the New Testament, but Lego ego does, and it could give us a new way to read Philippians 4:11. Paul wrote, I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances, and those circumstances could include someone refusing to Lego my ego. We've learned a little bit of Greek and Hebrew. Now I need to cover theology, church history, Jewish-Christian relations, and biblical interpretation very quickly. So I offer you this story. Many Jews were living in Rome, and the Pope decided that he wanted to debate them. The Jews assumed the Pope's request for a debate was merely a ploy to justify kicking them out of the city. None of the rabbis in Rome would agree to debate the Pope, so they finally decided to ask a guy named Moshe to do it. He was not a learned man, but the Jews figured, hey, we're going to lose, so it doesn't matter. Moshe agreed to the debate, but under one condition, neither he nor the Pope could use words. The Pope agreed to the strange request of a silent debate. The Pope kicked things off by doing this. Moshe responded by pointing at the ground. The Pope held up 3 fingers. Moshe responded by holding up 1. Seeming a bit flustered, the Pope brought out the bread and wine of communion. Moshe took out an apple. The Pope was stunned. He walked away in amazement. The Jews were equally surprised, but they thought Moshe had just pulled off a Hanukkah miracle that would allow them to stay in Rome. The cardinals went to ask the Pope what happened. Now, not the St. Louis Cardinals, but the Catholic Cardinals. I realized it may have looked like I was using baseball signs. Didn't want anyone to be confused. So the Pope said, I told him that God is everywhere. But he countered by saying, God is right here. Next, the Pope said, I told him about the Trinity. But then he really threw me for a loop when he reminded me that there's only one God. Then I took out the bread and wine to show him the communion we have with Christ. I was stunned when he took out an apple to remind me of original sin. Meanwhile, the Jews desperately wanted to know how Moshe had pulled off the upset of the century, so they asked him what happened. Moshe said, he told me the Jews have to get out. I told him, we're staying right here. He said, the Jews have 3 days to leave. I said, not one of us is leaving. Moshe stopped, so his friends asked, so what happened with the bread and wine in your apple? Moshe said, he took out his lunch, so I took out mine. The story certainly illustrates the great potential for confusion when we discuss theological matters. We all have our own perspectives on things, but if we learn to stay in his covenant, let go of our ego, we can do the impossible and find victory when all hope seems lost. And that's just a bit of food for thought tonight. But I encourage you to enroll at Urshan and learn more about leadership, practical theology, counseling, music, human services, communications, and many of the other subjects we teach here at Urshan. Hopefully, I've given just a brief summary of a few things our graduates have learned. But what about the things you graduates unintentionally learned in the process of being at Urshan? Things that weren't part of any lesson plan or curriculum, but things that were necessary to success. There's a great deal of unintentional learning that takes place in academic institutions. I discovered this on my first day of kindergarten. Now, keep in mind, I was 5 years old when these events happened, so don't judge me too harshly. Also, keep in mind, this story occurred in the late 70s. So on the first day of kindergarten, the coolest kid in the class comes up to talk to me. Now, we were too young to realize that we should have been natural enemies because he was a cool kid and I was a nerd. But we just didn't realize it, so he was still talking to me because kindergartners don't know that. So he came up to talk to me and he says, "You know what?" I says, "What?" He says, "Man, there are some really hot chicks in this kindergarten." Now, I was told that I needed to go to kindergarten to learn letters, shapes, numbers, and colors. I did not know that I was going to learn this vital lesson the first day of kindergarten, but it's something I didn't forget. And I told my parents and grandparents that night the lesson that I learned. And I must say, unintentional learning is a good thing. Now, many of you graduates enrolled at Urshan College with the purest of motives. You told your parents you wanted to educate yourselves and earn your college degree. You told your pastor that God had called you to Urshan College for the most spiritual of purposes. You signed up to press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. But I think that many of you also joined our great community for a slightly different reason. And for some of you, sorry to say, things didn't work out well, and you wound up singing that mournful yet comedic lament, "Breaking Up at Urshan." Others of you are engaged and are entering a new phase in life, and I wish you the best. After all, I can't judge you too harshly because I changed colleges after my sophomore year because there was a beautiful, intelligent girl at another school. But it all worked out. We've been married for 23 years. We were blessed with a son named Luke. He was born the day after 9/11, and he was 18 months old when I started my pursuit of my doctorate. I enjoyed the process because I wasn't solely focused on the end goal. I wanted every moment to be enjoyable with my wife and my son because they are not just part of my legacy. They are part of my legacy. And I love you both very much. And I'm thankful to see UGST graduates coming in. I saw Brother Whitmire pushing in a stroller, and I thought, what an awesome sight. And I commend you for all that you have done, your legacy and your legacy that will live on through them. Now, in talking and joking a little bit about our Urshan College students, I don't want you to think that they are not focused on spiritual things, because they are. On a couple of occasions, I've walked by our Urshan students having Holy Ghost prayer meeting in the UGST chapel, and when I walked by, I was touched by the Spirit of God. I began to speak in tongues because they set the stage for a move of God to happen. And at that moment, I was no longer an academic dean, a professor, a guy with 3 letters after his name. I was just a man outside the camp that caught the fire that they prayed down. And I can't tell you how many times they've ministered to me through prayers, singing, sermons. It's a bit of unintentional learning because I'm learning from them. And I would caution you not to give in to misconceptions about this generation of Urshan College students, because these Urshan College students aren't your typical millennials. Be careful. Don't you dare call them snowflakes, because some of them are self-contained blizzards. They are a flurry of activity from dawn to dusk and beyond. Some of these young ladies wake up early to be nannies. They go to class. They have a chorale practice. They go back, pick up the kids as a nanny. They have a night class. They have a music practice. They head back to a meeting. They will outwork, outpray, outsing, outworship, and outdo many of us. And I'm so proud of them and of the young men at Urshan. These gentlemen show great respect to others. They are always ready to lend a hand, whether it's helping with a project or laying hands on someone to pray for them. These guys have a servant's heart. You won't find a better group of young men and young women than the ones before you this evening. I watched our Urshan College students bring a situation to the administration. They respectfully disagreed, but they did it in the right way. They are a refreshing change from some of the disappointing behavior occurring on other college campuses. Rather than rioting, they showed right attitudes. Rather than protesting, they passed the test before them like pros. Rather than being violent, they refused to violate their conscience. They respectfully disagreed, and in the end, it didn't matter how the issue was decided because they won the real battle. And I can't tell you how pleased I am to report on these kind spirits and great attitudes. But most importantly, God is pleased with these students. Amen. Now, these students didn't sign up to learn those lessons, but they showed their expertise. They became examples of doing the right thing, and we could all, including me, learn a lot from them. They are leaving a great legacy at Urshan, and if they hold fast to their principles, they will have great legacies. I love unintentional learning because it opens up new doors for us. I had my own journey with unintentional learning. When I got up to speak, those who truly know me had a question on their mind. They weren't wondering about the theological insights I would bring. They weren't thinking about the challenges I would set forth. No, they were wondering if I would talk about superheroes. In fact, some specifically asked me if I would, and since I don't want to disappoint anyone, I will. When I was working on my Jewish Studies minor at Vanderbilt University, I designed a course on anti-Semitism, and as I began to study the subject, I learned that many Jews worked in the comic book industry because anti-Semitism prevented them from finding work in the mainstream media. Jewish artists and writers created characters like Superman, Batman, Captain America, and Spider-Man. Their Jewishness often unintentionally, as well as intentionally, made its way into the pages of their comic books. Biblical undertones and Jewish themes appear in many of them. And I had the opportunity to teach a summer class for gifted youth entitled Anti-Semitism and Comic Book Heroes. We studied the Justice League and thought about ways that we could be a social justice league, a force for good that challenged oppression in the world and tried to help the less fortunate. As I continued to research the biblical and religious aspects of comic books, I came across an NPR interview about a man who decided to take the great American hero Spider-Man and relocate his story to India. Spider-Man was created by a Jewish guy named Stanley Lieber, who you probably know better as Stan Lee. And he was inspired by the words of Daniel chapter 2, which speak of a statue with feet of iron and feet of clay, to create a hero with strength like iron, but very much like clay because he was so human. Now, in translating the story into Spider-Man India, it was not necessarily difficult to do. But there was one area that did not translate so well. In the American version of Spider-Man, Peter Parker's classmates made fun of him for being a bookworm. Flash Thompson mocked puny Parker for liking science-y stuff. In India, this depiction simply would not work because everyone in India is expected to do well in school. And as a result, Spider-Man India was made fun of because he was poor and wore more traditional clothing. And I think this story, the contrast between India and America, illustrates America's love-hate relationship with education. Many Americans think it's valuable, but they often question its necessity. And Apostolic Pentecostals have had a similar relationship with education. It is often viewed with suspicion. There are many misconceptions about what we do at Urshan College and Urshan Graduate School of Theology. But I would point anyone with questions not to our president, our executive vice president, our board, or our faculty. Instead, I would say to them, behold these graduates. For before you are present and future pastors, current and future church planners, evangelists, missionaries, worship leaders, corporate leaders, world leaders, and world changers. You will be blessed when you hear them sing, testify, and preach. You will be inspired when you see them writing songs and books and expanding the reach of the apostolic movement. That's why I charge these graduates to go and mentor someone. Take what you've learned and bless someone else. Many of you have already done that, but there are more out there who need you. They need your kindness. They need your expertise. They need to hear your voice speaking into their lives. Now, many people would admonish you to go out and fight the good fight of faith and be a righteous warrior and a defender of the faith. And I truly believe that there are times when we must stand up for what is right. There was a time for David to stand up to Goliath and challenge the Philistine giant for defying the name of God. And we rejoice in the victory of that ultimate underdog, but we can find many examples in Scripture where battles were won, but the war continued. When we look at these instances, we discover that our greatest weapon in the fight for faith is mentoring others. And that's the final lesson I want to share with you. Although many people focus on defending the faith, the future of the faith is won and lost in each new generation. Therefore, we must equip them, prepare them, and perpetuate the cycle. I believe it was mentoring Joshua that was Moses' greatest achievement. Moses defeated Pharaoh's magicians, but Pharaoh didn't let the people go just because Moses won. Although God eventually set the Israelites free, salvation really wasn't tied to Moses' victory over the Egyptians. But it was in Joshua who took the promised land. He fulfilled Moses' legacy. Joshua's conquest was Moses' victory. If you think I'm on the wrong track here, consider the case of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Yes, Elijah called fire down from heaven and defeated those false prophets. It was an amazing victory. Nevertheless, we next see Elijah fleeing for his life because his win over the prophets angered Jezebel. After his great accomplishment, Elijah experienced a season of great depression. But how did God bring him up out of his dejection? He had him go and anoint Elisha. Elisha was a go-getter. He achieved a double portion. His mentor, Elijah, had an amazing record of defeating false prophets and calling fire down from heaven. But I think that anointing Elisha to be prophet in his stead was his greatest victory. For what is Elijah's legacy without Elisha? And finally, I offer to you the example of David and Abishai. David won many victories, but his sin with Bathsheba and Absalom's coup looked like they would taint his legacy forever. Near the end of his life, David found himself face to face with another Philistine giant. This time it looked like the giant would get the upper hand. And they say your life flashes before your eyes before you die. And I wonder what David was thinking. Was he thinking about dying a warrior's death, killing a giant in his youth, now going down fighting a giant as an old man? Or did he view it as punishment for his sins? Could he hear the Philistines mockingly singing, David has killed his 10,000s, but now David is slain. Long live King David. We don't know what he was thinking because Abishai saved him. Abishai was a loyal follower of David, and he had been waiting for his moment for a long time. He was a real go-getter, just like his brothers Asahel and Joab. These men had tenacity with a capital T, but their ambitions were not always godly or wise. We see Asahel having a fire rage within him, but running himself to death, literally. We see Joab rise in the ranks, become David's general, only to see his loyalty turn to betrayal. But Abishai remained loyal to David. There was even a point where they made their way into Saul's camp, and Abishai said that he would kill Saul and he would not need to strike a second time. But David protected him by refusing to allow him to kill the Lord's anointed. Abishai waited for his moment and finally found it when he killed the giant for David. And in doing so, Abishai cemented his legacy as a great warrior, and at the same time, he revived the legacy of David. Other Israelites went on to kill giants. Giant killing ability did not die with David. It lived on in Abishai and others. The legacies of Moses, Elijah, and David are tied to their legacies with Joshua, Elisha, and Abishai. So tonight, graduates, I want to encourage you to go and mentor someone. You conquered a giant by graduating, and I know you've conquered many other giants in your lives. Pass your giant killing ability on to someone else. Teach them the lessons that you've learned, both intentionally and unintentionally. Learn new lessons and share them with others. I look forward to hearing you preach these lessons, teach these lessons, sing them, write them, wherever and whenever God leads you. And remember that you can only create a great legacy by having a great legacy. Thank you.